Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on, well, an epic journey through history. We're guided by a singular, comprehensive account, and we're going to unravel a really complex period. Think ambition, monumental conquest, and that fierce struggle for freedom that ultimately reshaped an entire continent. Get ready to explore the profound impact of Spanish colonialism in Latin America, and, of course, the extraordinary fight for independence spearheaded by Simon Bolivar.
Yeah, and what's truly captivating here is how intricately woven the ascent and eventual decline of this immense colonial power were. You've got these major European shifts connected with unique internal dynamics of the conquered lands themselves. We're not just looking at what happened, but really delving into how one of the world's most dominant empires, well, came into being, and the mechanisms it used to maintain control for centuries, and crucially, what ultimately triggered its dramatic unraveling, paving the way for new nations.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to extract the most crucial nuggets of knowledge and insight, giving you a genuine shortcut to becoming truly well-informed on this pivotal chapter of global history. We'll navigate everything from the initial European discovery, and we should probably put quotes around that late and its brutal aftermath, to the intricate, often oppressive administrative system Spain meticulously put in place. And finally, the incredible, tumultuous story of how new societies emerged from this crucible and bravely fought for their freedom.
And crucially, we'll connect those grand narratives, those big historical sweeps, to the very human experiences that define this era, exploring the fundamental why behind these seismic shifts and understanding the deep, lasting implications of 3 centuries of colonial rule, which, raises an important question for us to consider right from the start. How does an empire built on such rapid, forceful expansion and maintained by exploitation manage to sustain its grip for so long? And what specific factors finally ignite its complete and utter unraveling?
Hmm.
The dawn of an empire, Spain's ascent and the discovery of the New World.
Okay, let's unpack this pivotal moment in history, 1492. When we think of 1492, our minds almost immediately jump to Christopher Columbus, right? But for Spain itself, that year was far more than just about a single voyage. It was a year of profound internal transformation that fundamentally set the stage for its grand global ambitions. Before 1492, Spain wasn't really the unified powerhouse we might imagine. It was more a collection of distinct kingdoms. So what really defined this transformative year for the Iberian Peninsula?
Indeed. 1492 marked the successful culmination of the Reconquista, that centuries-long, absolutely monumental effort to expel the Muslim Moors from the Iberian Peninsula, culminating in the fall of Granada. Simultaneously, and perhaps even more starkly, it saw the forced expulsion of Jews from the country. This wasn't just a political or military victory. It was a deeply symbolic and ideological purification for the Spanish crown. This consolidation of power under the Catholic monarchs, King Fernando of Aragon and Queen Isabel of Castile, by uniting their dynasties and centralizing authority, created a politically unified Spanish kingdom, a kingdom with a singular, fervent purpose. This newfound internal peace and a powerful, almost messianic national identity meant they saw the New World not just as territory to claim, but as souls to convert and resources to be claimed for what they saw as a divinely sanctioned mission. It set an incredibly aggressive, religiously fervent tone for everything that followed, and it provided a stable, ambitious platform for which to launch outward.
That intense drive for Eastern riches really set the stage then. We constantly hear about the allure of spices and silk from the East. But what exactly was driving this seemingly insatiable demand? What made these perilous journeys across unknown seas so incredibly appealing, despite the immense risks, the uncertainties involved?
It was an obsession, truly. Medieval Europe was absolutely captivated by the immense wealth of the East. Think spices like cinnamon and pepper, not just for flavor, but preservatives, status symbols even, silks, luxurious fabrics, and of course gold, the ultimate measure of power and prosperity. After the failed Crusades, which were these direct attempts to control overland routes to the east, the strategic focus dramatically shifted. The goal became finding new, safer, and crucially, more direct sea routes to India, the fabled land of gold and spices. This shift was largely enabled by significant advancements in 15th century sailing techniques and geographical knowledge, particularly pioneered by the Spanish and Portuguese, who were really at the cutting edge of naval innovation back then.
Okay.
So in this context, Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor with a bold, though ultimately mistaken, theory about the world's size, set sail under the Spanish crown in 1492. His explicit goal: a shortcut to Asia, to claim a share of the East's immense wealth, bypassing the existing, costly, and often dangerous overland routes controlled by others. And the Spanish monarchs, well, they stood to gain a staggering 9/10 of all goods brought back from what they believed would be India.
9/10. That's incredible. It shows the huge economic incentive driving these high-stakes expeditions.
Absolutely immense potential profit.
It's genuinely astonishing to think about this next detail, though. Columbus, even after 4 extensive voyages to what we now know as the New World, remained utterly convinced he had reached Asia. How could he have explored so much and still clung so firmly to that profound misconception?
Well, one of history's great ironies, isn't it? He lived and died believing he'd reached the East, which is precisely why he called the indigenous people he encountered Indians. He extensively explored Central America, the Caribbean, all the major islands in what's now Honduras during his 4 expeditions. Yet the true nature of his discovery remained completely elusive to him.
Wow.
It was another Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci, sailing for both Spain and Portugal, who later had that pivotal realization. This was in fact a previously unknown continent, a new world. This groundbreaking insight is why the continent is widely suggested to have been named America after Vespucci, acknowledging his critical discovery.
Right, hence the name.
Though it's also important to note that cartographer Gerardus Mercator gets credit too. He drew the continent's map in 1538 and used the name America for the entire landmass, which really solidified that name in history books. It speaks to the gradual dawning of a new understanding of global geography, a realization that took time to sink in, even for the explorers themselves.
The first encounters between the Spanish and the indigenous peoples are incredibly telling, aren't they? What really stands out about these initial interactions, especially considering the stark contrast in cultures and technological development?
Oh, the initial encounters are just a tragic prelude to everything that followed. The Spanish crown, seeing the immense potential for wealth and expansion, actively encouraged navigators to continue exploration where Columbus left off. These explorers, arriving in the Americas, encountered diverse indigenous societies, some incredibly advanced like the Maya, Inca, and Aztec civilizations, others living in more communal, less hierarchical structures, despite often being met with hospitality, even generosity, from the native populations. The Spanish viewed them through this lens of profound cultural, technological, and religious bias. They categorized them as barbaric, undeveloped, and deviant terms that completely dehumanized them. And this dehumanizing perspective was absolutely critical to how they justified their subsequent brutal actions.
So they encountered these major civilizations, Maya, Inca, Aztec, which were incredibly advanced in their own right.
Exactly. Sophisticated political structures, agricultural systems, incredible architectural feats. Yet the Spanish, following their initial discoveries, didn't just explore. They immediately launched swift and brutal conquest movements, prioritizing the elimination of these powerful civilizations. And to legitimize their conquest, the systematic seizure of lands and resources. The Spanish frequently claimed the natives engaged in practices they deemed abhorrent, things like human sacrifice, cannibalism, sodomy, and incest.
Horrific accusations.
They argued these alleged practices constituted violations of natural law, thereby concluding that the natives had no rights to the continent. This chilling narrative allowed them to justify their unimpeded conquest movements and brutal subjugation without, any apparent moral qualms.
So this quickly transitioned from exploration to swift and ruthless conquest. It genuinely feels impossible for a relatively small number of Spanish to subjugate entire established civilizations so quickly. How on earth did they manage such a rapid takeover? Was it purely military might? Or were there other factors at play, less obvious ones perhaps?
It was indeed astonishingly rapid and brutal, and no, it wasn't just pure military might, though that certainly played a huge part. There were several interconnected and devastating factors at play. Primarily, yes, the Spanish relied on their superior military technology. Firearms, arquebuses, cannons, steel weapons that could cut through native armor, and cavalry. Horses were utterly unknown in the Americas and frankly terrifying to indigenous forces. That gave the Spanish a psychological and tactical edge.
Right, the shock factor of horses.
Absolutely. But beyond technology, the Spanish were incredibly adept at exploiting existing rivalries among the diverse indigenous groups. They'd skillfully form alliances with one group against another, promising protection or rewards, thereby weakening the overall indigenous resistance from within. They turned existing animosities into their own strategic advantage.
Divide and conquer, essentially.
Pretty much. But what's truly astonishing and tragically devastating here is the overwhelming role of epidemic diseases. Europeans brought diseases like measles, mumps, plague, influenza, and especially smallpox, to which American natives had no prior exposure and thus absolutely no immunity whatsoever. These diseases spread like wildfire, moving from the Caribbean islands into the more densely populated regions of Central and South America.
The impact must have been catastrophic.
Utterly catastrophic, wiping out an estimated 50% to, in some areas, 90% of the local population, even before direct military engagement. Imagine trying to fight an invading army when your society is simultaneously collapsing from an unseen enemy. When your leaders, healers, and warriors are dying by the tens of thousands. This wasn't just a military advantage. It was an accidental biological weapon of unparalleled destructive power.
So it was this deadly combination then, technology, strategy, and disease.
Exactly. Technological superiority, a strategic exploitation of internal divisions, and the biological warfare of disease. That combination played the crucial role in the swift and almost unbelievable elimination of indigenous civilizations by the Spanish. And this horrific start marked a violent colonial expansion, allowing Spain to control the immense riches of the New World for an astonishing 300 years. 2. Establishing a colonial system, exploitation, administration, and resistance.
Spain didn't just conquer. It became the world's most powerful nation almost overnight, really, thanks to the New World's immense resources. This wasn't just about claiming land, was it? What does this all mean for the sheer scale of wealth extracted? How transformative was it for Spain?
It was absolutely monumental, a true financial and geopolitical game changer. After discovering America, the Spanish continued expeditions with this insatiable drive for wealth and global dominance. Spanish conquerors, many of them experienced navigators, battle-hardened soldiers, spread their rule over vast territories. Mexico, Central America, a significant portion of South America except Brazil, which was Portugal's. And all of this unfolded within a mere half-century.
Incredible speed.
The conquest of Hernán Cortés in Mexico, systematically annihilating the Aztec civilization, and Francisco Pizarro in Peru, destroying the Inca Empire. These were particularly significant. They didn't just conquer. They systematically melted down unique gold statues, priceless artifacts, countless intricate ornaments, converting these irreplaceable cultural treasures into currency to be shipped directly back to Spain.
Just melted down. Heartbreaking.
And the continuous flow of all these captured precious metals contributed enormously to the formation of a global Spanish empire. It fundamentally transformed their financial might. Then came the truly incredible stroke of luck. The discovery of vast silver mines in the Potosi Mountains, in what's now Bolivia, in 1545.
Potosi, that name comes up again and again.
It does, and for good reason. To put this in staggering perspective, while all of Europe's annual silver production was around 60,000 kilograms, Potosi alone quickly produced an astounding 266,200 kilograms annually.
Wow, more than 4 times Europe's total.
Exactly. And for gold, the Americas produce an average of 5,400 kilograms annually, absolutely dwarfing Europe's 1,000 kilograms and Africa's 2,000 in the same period. The fame of these unbelievably rich mines, especially Potosi and Zacatecas in Mexico, discovered shortly after, led to an unprecedented influx of people, animals, machinery into their surroundings. Potosi became one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the world at the time. These mines were the main sources of Spain's power and wealth throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, transforming it from a relatively resource-poor country into the undeniable global powerhouse it became, funding its wars and its vast empire for centuries.
Beyond the insatiable hunger for gold and glory, the sources highlight a powerful religious dimension to Spain's expansion. It seems like the spiritual conquest, the imposition of Catholicism, was as central to their mission as the military and economic ones. Why was that so important?
Absolutely. You really can't fully explain the discovery of America and the subsequent Spanish expansion without considering the deeply ingrained medieval crusader tradition prevalent in Spain. Following the successful Reconquista, that long struggle to reclaim Spain from Muslim rule, there was this powerful sense of divine mandate, religious zeal that extended beyond their borders.
That context is key.
It is. The Catholic Church didn't hesitate to give a sacred character to the conquest of unknown lands across the ocean. Pope Alexander VI, who himself was from Valencia, even went so far as to declare Queen Isabel Queen of the New World, effectively granting divine sanction to Spain's claims and actions. So the expansion of the Spanish crown was seen as a direct extension of God's earthly kingdom. It made the conquest a holy mission.
So it wasn't just about resources, it was about salvation in their view.
In their view, yes. This dual ambition shows that Spain's expansionist policy in the New World was as much religious as it was political and economic. A primary objective of the Spanish crown was explicitly imposing Catholic Christianity on the ancient inhabitants of the newly discovered lands. This wasn't just a byproduct of conquest. It was a core mission entrusted to the Spanish crown directly by the Roman Catholic Church. And it was crucial for legitimizing Spanish conquests in the New World, indicating what historical texts refer to as a new crusader spirit. It framed the brutal occupation and exploitation as a benevolent act of salvation, a way to civilize and save the souls of the indigenous peoples.
That framing is powerful.
Very. Spanish historian Fernando de los Rios summarized this dual ambition beautifully. He said essentially, Spain displayed two aggressive tendencies, military and spiritual, both combative and eager to conquer. While the aim of military conquest was to gain power, land, and wealth, the spiritual conquest aimed to gain loyalty to Christianity. It was a complete package of domination, body and soul, woven into the very fabric of their imperial project.
After establishing this vast, resource-rich empire, Spain poured immense effort into creating an intricate web of control, from viceroyalties to the Council of the Indies, attempting to centralize power over vast distances. How did they attempt to manage it all from so far away, and what were the key components of this administrative structure?
Well, by the 16th century, Spain had indeed created the world's largest colonial empire, stretching across vast oceans and continents. The sheer scale of this rapid expansion necessitated not just military control, but also incredibly sophisticated administrative structuring and institutionalization in the conquered territories. Initially, the soldiers and explorers who led the conquest were rewarded with positions like governors or royal officials. And then came a rapid influx of Spanish settlers. The Spanish meticulously established an administrative structure in America that mirrored, as closely as possible, their own state organization back in the metropolis. They appointed viceroys, the highest royal authorities, along with captain generals for military regions, bishops for religious authority, judges for legal oversight, all while systematically settling lands with Spanish immigrants.
So a top-down structure mirroring Spain itself.
Exactly. And it's important to note a crucial shift. The initial free reign enjoyed by Spanish conquerors in the first half of the 16th century was gradually brought under the direct, centralized control of the Spanish crown as the latter half. This shift was absolutely vital because those immensely valuable silver and gold mines, Pocosi, Zacatecas, Guanajuato, were simply too precious to be left to autonomous local rule. The crown recognized that such immense wealth had to be directly managed to ensure its continuous flow back to Spain, funding the empire.
Makes sense. Control the cash flow.
Precisely. The Spanish kings, driven by this desire to extend their absolute authority and monarchical centralism, worked tirelessly to implement this strict control in the Americas. Since the conquered lands were considered the direct property of the Spanish crown, laws and governance were intended to be as similar as possible to those in the metropolis. This led to the development of a detailed and comprehensive body of legislation called the Leyes de Indias, the Laws of the Indies, meticulously outlining governance, rights, responsibilities for everyone in the colonies. They also created municipal and political judicial institutions like audiencias, high courts, with significant administrative functions, all deeply rooted in Spanish tradition.
And how was the territory itself divided up? It was huge.
It was immense. So the colonies were systematically divided into vast administrative units called viceroyalties. The first was New Spain, established in 1535. It was enormous, stretching from what's now the southwestern U.S. down through Mexico and Central America, and even incredibly extending to the Philippines. The other major one, Peru, established in 1569, initially covered most of South America.
Wow, just those two covered almost everything initially.
Pretty much. Later, as the empire grew and became more complex, new viceroyalties were carved out for more effective administration. New Granada, established definitively in 1740, covering modern-day Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, and Venezuela. And finally, the Viceroyalty of La Plata was created in 1776, covering areas like Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay. Each viceroyalty was further subdivided into kingdoms and regions, headed by corregidores or alcalde mayors, royal officials overseeing local affairs. This elaborate system created the concept of overseas royal officials, all meticulously appointed from the center in Spain to ensure maximum control and direct loyalty to the crown.
And who is pulling the strings back in Spain?
The most significant institutional innovation was the Council of the Indies, established by Charles V in 1524. This powerful body worked closely with the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, founded back in 1503. These two bodies were absolutely critical. They were responsible for the smooth functioning of colonial administrations at every level by appointing and instructing colonial bureaucrats. The Council of the Indies was a legislative powerhouse for Spanish America. It enacted laws, organized the administration, appointed candidates for positions, theoretically protected the natives, acted as the final appeals court. It covered all aspects of governance, legislative, judicial, executive. It was the ultimate authority consulted by the Spanish king on all major issues regarding native governance and colonial affairs.
And the House of Trade.
The Casa de Contratación focused on controlling all trade and economic relations, strictly enforcing a mercantilist system, ensuring that immense wealth flowed directly back to Spain, often stifling the economic development of the colonies themselves. Now, while the Council of the Indies' presence and control mechanisms initially helped prevent Spanish governors from acting entirely autonomously in the 16th century, and every institution was theoretically tied directly to the monarch, the immense distance between Spain and its American colonies ultimately made healthy, centralized management incredibly difficult. Centralization, despite all efforts, was never fully and harshly implemented, which led to some pretty significant unintended consequences.
So Spain poured immense effort into creating this intricate web of control, trying to centralize power. Yet you've hinted that despite these grand designs, something went terribly wrong. Where did this meticulously structured system begin to unravel, especially regarding the treatment of the native populations? It sounds like a well-intentioned, maybe albeit hierarchical system on paper, but clearly the reality was far more oppressive.
You're absolutely right. The initial intent, at least on paper, did include some measures for fairness. Initially, strict rules were indeed in place to ensure what was considered fair treatment of natives and to prevent rampant abuse by administrators. For example, viceroys, royal governors, corregidors even had to publicly account for their administration and answer complaints upon leaving office, a system designed in theory for accountability.
Accountability theater, perhaps?
Perhaps, because this system eventually decayed and became profoundly corrupt. Corruption in governance became rampant, and Spanish administrators, despite being appointed by the monarchy, began to establish their own, often brutal dominion in the colonies, frequently without adhering to any rules or oversight.
Power corrupts.
Indeed. These Spanish administrators were generally former conquerors or their descendants. They held key public powers, sometimes even nobility titles. As governance deteriorated, these powerful individuals increased their independence in the regions they administered, effectively imposing a seigneurial authority over the natives. This led to the formation of what amounted to semi-feudal states. This marked the very clear implementation of a feudal system in Latin America, a stark departure from the Crown's stated intentions of integration. The vast civilizational gap and immense power imbalance prevented natives from ever being equal, free individuals with the Spanish. The Spanish considered themselves noble, or aspired to be, and viewed their relationship with the natives as one of lord-serf.
And this relationship had a specific name.
It did. This deeply unequal relationship in the New World was specifically called encomiendo. Theoretically, it granted a Spaniard, an encomendero, the right to receive tribute or labor from natives living on a specific land, in exchange for Christianizing and protecting them. It was designed, on paper, as a non-profit system intended to civilize and integrate the indigenous population.
But the reality?
The reality was devastating. In practice, the encomiendo brought many negative consequences for Spanish America. Encomenderos began seizing new lands for themselves and flagrantly neglecting their responsibilities for Christianization and protection. Basing their approach on Aristotle's controversial concept of natural slavery, the idea that some people were inherently suited for servitude, the Spanish ruthlessly exploited natives within the encomiendo system. This led to countless deaths from malnutrition, brutal physical abuse, horrific working conditions in mines and fields. The critical lack of effective internal control mechanisms allowed for its widespread abuse, effectively introducing a form of forced labor that was tantamount to slavery, despite the Crown's stated prohibitions against outright slavery of natives.
It's crucial, though, you're saying, that the monarchy itself didn't intend this outcome.
It's crucial to understand, yes. The Spanish monarchy, particularly Catholic monarchs like Charles V and Philip II, never actually intended for a serfdom system to emerge in Latin America. They envisioned assimilation, where Spaniards and natives would ideally form a single people, with America becoming an integrated province of Spain itself. Their grand goal was to impart all aspects of Spanish life: Christianization, teaching Castilian, transmitting Spanish customs, attire, behavior, ceremonies, social and political forms. The encomienda system, in principle, only granted the right to collect taxes or labor, not ownership of the land itself.
But the loophole was the exploitation.
Exactly. By burdening natives with heavy taxes and impossible labor quotas, the new feudal lords in the colonies successfully appropriated communal and personal native lands, mirroring the land accumulation tactics of their European predecessors. In this corrupted system, the colonial lord, much like a feudal lord, was expected to feed, clothe, protect, and even judge the natives under his service. Loyalty of this colonial master was not only perpetual, but also encompassed native families, entire villages, even several generations, trapping them in a brutal cycle of forced labor and dependence that left deep, deep scars.
So you can see how a system designed with one intention, however flawed, became something far more oppressive in practice. This raises that important question again. How does a distant central authority truly enforce its will when faced with powerful local actors who benefit immensely from its corruption? The sheer geographical distance and the lure of immense wealth seem to have created a fertile ground for unchecked power.
Precisely. And this systemic failure had profound and lasting consequences. The encomienda system, despite its stated intent to civilize and protect, essentially formalized a new brutal form of servitude. Beyond the immediate suffering, it fundamentally stratified colonial society along rigid racial and ethnic lines, creating a deeply entrenched caste system. At the very top, the peninsular Spaniards born in Spain, holding all the highest positions. Below them, the Creole Spanish descendants born in the Americas, wealthy, educated, but marginalized from top power. Then the mixed race groups, mestizos, Spanish indigenous, mulattoes, Spanish African, Zambos, indigenous African, and at the very bottom, the indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. This was the blueprint for deeply ingrained social and economic inequalities that Latin American nations still grapple with today, a legacy of unequal land ownership, power structures, racial tensions that began right here.
So this encomiendo system essentially turned natives into forced laborers, which, logically, sparked various forms of resistance over time. What was the monarchy's response to this growing unrest, and who ultimately spearheaded the fight for freedom, especially as we move into the 19th century? It seems like there's a complex interplay of forces that finally broke through.
Well, the enslavement of natives under the encomiendo system did indeed provoke strong reactions and reports of abuse, particularly from some religious orders and reform-minded individuals who saw the brutality firsthand. The Spanish crown did respond, issuing laws that nominally prohibited the enslavement of natives, showing at least a stated intent to curb the worst excesses. However, and this is crucial, the royal representatives in the continent, the Spanish governors and administrators who were benefiting immensely from the system, reacted with hostility. And crucially, these rules were largely unenforced.
Conveniently ignored, you might say.
Pretty much. As a result, the Spanish administrative machinery in Latin America gradually shifted towards a feudal order, leading to the formation of powerful local states rather than a centrally controlled imperial bureaucracy. Administrative officials, leveraging the immense distance from the Spanish crown and the weak enforcement of royal decrees, became absolute rulers of their regions, building personal fiefdoms that operated largely outside metropolitan control. Thus, the encomiendo system inadvertently limited the power of the Spanish crown of the New World, giving way to the formidable local powers of a new type of colonial feudal lord.
And these local powers eventually weakened.
Yes, these local feudal powers, though initially strong and oppressive, began to weaken towards the 19th century. Their incredibly harsh treatment of natives, the entrenched institution of slavery, the consistent disregard for native demands, the complete lack of rights, all led to simmering discontent and sporadic resistance movements in the early 19th century. However, the factor that truly allowed this widespread discontent to coalesce and transform into full-blown independence movements was a dramatic external event: the French occupation of Portugal and Spain starting in 1808.
Ah, Napoleon again. The chaos in Europe creates an opportunity.
Exactly. With the mother countries in Europe under foreign rule weakened and embroiled in their own crisis of legitimacy, the colonies saw a critical window of opportunity. They began to openly declare that they did not want to live under the rule of a foreign European power. Whether it's the French or, ultimately, the now clearly weakened and distracted Spanish crown, they saw a moment of profound vulnerability and seized it.
And who led this charge initially? Was it the indigenous populations rising up?
Interestingly, no. The initial widespread backlash against Spanish rule didn't primarily come from the native population, who were brutally suppressed and largely disempowered. It came from the Creoles. These Spanish descendants born in the Americas, often wealthy landowners, merchants, professionals. Despite strict Spanish censorship, the liberal ideas of the 18th century, individual rights, popular sovereignty, national self-determination, self-governance, ideas transforming Europe with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, began to permeate the colonies.
So the Creoles brought these ideas back from Europe.
Many did. Wealthy Creoles, traveling to Spain and Europe for education, absorbed these new intellectual currents and brought them back to Latin America. This group, feeling marginalized by the peninsulares who held the highest positions and monopolized trade, increasingly saw themselves as distinct from Spain and perfectly capable of self-rule. This intellectual and social ferment includes towering figures like Simon Bolivar. Came from a wealthy Creole family, educated in Europe, returned to spearhead the independence movement, driven by a powerful vision to unify Latin America into a strong, independent entity. Third, Simon Bolivar and the past independence.
So the stage is set. The chaos gripping Spain created a perfect storm, a vacuum that colonial elites, particularly the Creoles, were ready to fill. What exactly happened at the beginning of the 19th century that finally ignited the widespread independence movements we know today?
The early 19th century was indeed incredibly turbulent in Europe, and Spain found itself right at the epicenter of much of that chaos. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain and placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. This act completely usurped the legitimate monarchy, throwing the entire country into political disarray and deep instability, creating an immediate crisis of legitimacy for Spanish rule, both at home and across its vast empire.
And the colonies reacted how?
Well, in January 1809, a representative of Joseph Bonaparte's new government arrived in Caracas, Venezuela, demanding continued tax payments and explicit recognition of Joseph as the legitimate king. This demand, far from being accepted, sparked a massive backlash in Caracas. The people, deeply loyal to their traditional monarchy, poured into the streets, vehemently declaring their loyalty to their former rightful king, Ferdinand VII, who was then imprisoned by Napoleon.
So loyalty to the old king, not the French usurper.
Precisely. This defiance quickly spread. Across Spain itself, anti-French juntas emergency, self-appointed governing councils formed to resist Napoleon and remain loyal to their imprisoned king. This model quickly found its way across the Atlantic. By 1810, Creole juntas were established in major South American cities: Caracas, Buenos Aires, Bogota, Cartagena, Santiago. These juntas were typically composed of wealthy, influential Creoles who, seizing the moment of perceived imperial weakness, effectively seized control in their respective regions. These independent-minded juntas represented the very first critical step towards independence as they began to govern the territories in the absence of clear, legitimate Spanish authority.
But this led to conflict with the existing Spanish officials.
Immediately, tensions escalated dramatically between these newly formed juntas and the existing Spanish governors who recognized the Creoles' true intentions. They saw this wasn't just about temporary loyalty to Ferdinand VII, but about self-rule and eventual permanent independence. Thus, the Latin American Wars of Independence, a series of complex and often brutal conflicts, had officially begun.
Venezuela seems to have been particularly at the forefront of this struggle, becoming a pivotal hotbed of revolution. What unique conditions or leaders made it such an early driver of independence?
Yeah, Venezuela's internal conditions for independence just matured earlier than in many other Latin American countries, which is precisely why it became the first country to officially separate from Spain in 1821. Key leaders like Francisco Miranda and Simon Bolivar were absolutely instrumental in this early push. Francisco Miranda, a Venezuelan soldier, was an incredibly experienced and visionary figure. He'd even served as a general in the French Revolution, absorbing revolutionary ideals there. He had attempted an unsuccessful revolution in Venezuela as early as 1806. Despite its failure, it was quietly supported by many forward-thinking Venezuelans yearning for self-rule.
And Bolivar followed in his footsteps.
Young followers like Simon Bolivar were deeply influenced by Miranda's Republican ideals. They wanted to break away from Spain entirely, establish their own republics, much like the successful American Revolution had done in the North. However, the path to independence wasn't straightforward from the start. In early 1810, Venezuela was indeed ripe for a decisive move towards self-governance. But the Caracas elite, while desiring autonomy, favored a temporary independence initially.
Temporary? How so?
Their primary opposition was to Joseph Bonaparte's illegitimate rule, not necessarily the Spanish crown itself. They envisioned establishing a junta that would govern themselves only until their legitimate monarch, Ferdinand VII, was restored to the throne. The Venezuelan Creoles convened a meeting in Caracas, and on April 19, 1810, they declared this temporary independence, agreeing to govern themselves until the Spanish monarchy was restored. For ardent revolutionaries like Simon Bolivar, who desired full, permanent independence, this was only a partial victory, a stepping stone, but probably seen as better than nothing.
But they started making changes right away.
Oh, yes. During this initial period of temporary self-governance, significant reforms were actually enacted. Slavery was abolished, indigenous people were exempted from taxes, trade barriers with other nations were lifted to encourage economic growth, and envoys were sent to the U.S. and Britain, signaling their emerging autonomy and desire for international recognition. What's crucial to understand is that the Latin American people, who had initially pledged loyalty to King Ferdinand while he was imprisoned, found themselves governing through these local juntas. But this very period of self-governance, this taste of freedom and responsibility, naturally fueled a much stronger, undeniable desire for permanent independence.
They got used to running things themselves.
Exactly. The Creoles, almost without fully realizing it at first, transformed from loyal subjects resisting French usurpation into full-fledged revolutionaries. Thus, actions initially aimed as resistance against French interference in Spain eventually transformed, quite organically, into a full-fledged war for independence against Spain itself.
So the struggle became overtly anti-Spanish. How did Bolivar's unique leadership truly emerge amidst this complex, evolving landscape? And what was his unique contribution, especially as the fighting intensified?
Well, the path to full independence was anything but simple, marked by shifting alliances, brutal conflicts. Four distinct uprisings occurred across Latin America against the Spanish Empire, starting in Venezuela, then spreading to Argentina and Chile. Mexico's uprising was entirely different in character, as was Brazil's against Portugal. The Venezuelan uprising, beginning in 1810 and led definitively by Simon Bolivar after 1813, ultimately resulted in the liberation of almost all former colonies and the emergence of 6 independent countries: Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. This was achieved despite Bolivar's fervent dream of a single, unified Latin American state, a dream that, sadly, was never fully realized.
So Venezuela declares full independence first.
Yes. With the start of the first uprising in Venezuela, radical voices within the junta government, particularly Bolivar and Miranda, pushed for an even bolder step. On July 5, 1811, they declared indefinite, full independence. The National Congress in Caracas formally recognized it, making Venezuela the very first Latin American country to officially sever all ties with Spain. This declaration, however, didn't bring immediate peace. Instead, it ignited a brutal civil war within Venezuela itself, pitting royalist forces loyal to Spain against the Republicans championing independence. Bolivar, demonstrating his unwavering commitment, served as an officer of the Republican Army fighting the royalists, honing his military skills amidst the chaos.
And then disaster struck.
Yes, amidst the Civil War, a devastating earthquake struck Venezuela in 1812. Widespread destruction, loss of life. Royalists quickly claimed nature itself was on Spain's side, interpreting it as divine punishment. To this, Bolivar defiantly retorted with his famous quote, "If nature takes up arms against us, we will declare war on it and make it obey us."
Wow, that shows incredible resolve.
Absolutely. His unwavering determination.
Yeah.
But the earthquake significantly destabilized the country, weakening the Republican cause. Exploiting these conditions, Juan Domingo de Monteverde, the Spanish representative, mobilized the royal army and attacked the Republicans fiercely. Faced with the rapid Spanish advance, the Republican government appointed Miranda as commander-in-chief, granting him extensive powers. But after Monteverde captured critical cities, Miranda, believing the situation hopeless, made the controversial decision to surrender. Signed an armistice on July 25, 1812. Venezuela, tragically, once again became a Spanish colony. Miranda was sent to Spain, died in a Cadiz prison.
And Bolivar, he didn't accept this surrender.
No, Bolivar was deeply dissatisfied. Considered it an act of treason, a betrayal. He refused defeat and, to avoid capture, fled Venezuela by sea to Cartagena in New Granada, modern-day Colombia. It was there he began to organize military resistance on his own terms. In Cartagena, he issued his first major political statement, the Cartagena Manifesto, a powerful document calling for the immediate overthrow of Spanish rule in Venezuela, viewing it as the essential beginning of continental unity and advocating for a strong central government across the newly independent territories.
What was the core message of the manifesto?
He argued for ruthlessness, essentially. He wrote, and I quote, "The administration must prove to be fearsome and ruthless, disregarding law and constitution until peace is achieved. Unless we unify our American governments, it will benefit the enemy. If we fail to do so, we will be caught in the insoluble networks of civil war and suffer a shameful defeat."
Ruthless administration. That sounds harsh.
It does, but the manifesto was more than just a political lesson for Venezuela. Its significance extended beyond immediate contexts. It addressed profound conceptual issues. Bolivar notably stepped back from some rigid liberal assumptions of the Age of Reason, distancing himself from Enlightenment ideals that preached universal principles without considering local realities. For the first time, he presented his own critical perspective, argued that institutions should be formed based on concrete realities, the needs of time and place, rational principles, rather than abstract philosophical ideals. He recognized Latin America's diversity, geography, colonial structures, demanded a flexible, even ruthless approach.
Pragmatism over pure ideology.
Exactly. He understood a perfectly democratic system wouldn't survive the chaos of civil war and fragmented loyalties. His ruthless administration idea, while hush, was born from this pragmatism. Sometimes stability and unity had to come first. This adaptability, this willingness to bend principles to reality, allowed him to forge alliances and make tough decisions. He passionately advocated for the unity of the entire continent to liberate Latin America, urging a common goal, collective action. He specifically implored New Granada to support Venezuela's liberation, deeming it essential for New Granada's security and for the freedom of all of South America. His vision was already continental.
So, armed with this evolving philosophy, Bolivar moved forward with incredible determination. What was the next major phase of his struggle, and how did he attempt to implement this ruthless but strategically essential war-to-the-death policy, especially given his observations about civil war?
Well, with the crucial support of Republicans in Cartagena, Bolivar took command of the army destined to liberate Venezuela, initiating what he termed a war-to-the-death policy. He issued his famous decree in Trujillo on July 15, 1813. This decree was stark, uncompromising. Spaniards and Canary Islanders would be killed unless they actively defended America's freedom, even if neutral. Americans, however, would be pardoned, even if deemed guilty of royalist sympathies.
A brutal distinction. Why pardon Americans fighting for Spain?
That exception was absolutely crucial. The war was largely a civil war, Americans fighting on both sides. Bolivar knew he couldn't wage a war to the death against his own people, even royalists. The Trujillo decree aimed to distinctly separate Spaniards from Americans, attempting to reframe the conflict not as internal Republican versus Royalist, but as a clear-cut fight between two separate nations, Spain and America. It was a brutal but strategically brilliant move to solidify nationalist sentiment and cut ties with the European colonizers.
And did it work militarily?
Initially, yes. Bolivar's army, bolstered by enthusiastic volunteers and defectors swayed by his message, advanced eastward with remarkable speed. The Republican army, under Bolivar's dynamic leadership, confronted the royalist Spanish army led by Monteverde. Bolivar's strategy was to neutralize Spanish forces around him to secure independence in New Granada, with Caracas as the main target. He crossed into Venezuela with only a few hundred men, but through swift, decisive actions, he systematically annihilated royalist units in isolated groups, employing guerrilla tactics, rapid movements. In 1813, he spectacularly re-entered Caracas, establishing a strong Republican government.
This was the admirable campaign.
Exactly. His incredibly successful struggle leading up to his entry into Caracas became known as the Admirable Campaign, a testament to his military genius. Monteverde, disgraced, was removed and returned to Spain. In recognition of his extraordinary achievements after reclaiming Caracas in 1813, Bolivar was universally given that revered title, El Libertador, the Liberator.
But this success was short-lived again.
Tragically, yes. The Admirable Campaign led to the formation of the Second Republic. But despite these early victories, this republic couldn't sustain itself even until the end of the year it was declared. The Republicans only concretely held governance from August 1813 to June 1814, less than a year. The primary reason: a critical lack of popular support from segments of the population, particularly the mixed-race llaneros, plainsmen, who initially sided with the Royalists. They had grievances against the Creole elite and saw the independence movement as mainly benefiting white elites.
And Spain pushed back.
Yes. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the regrouped Spanish forces could send reinforcements. Aided by loyalist units still strong in Venezuela, they managed to push back the Republicans decisively in 1814. This was a disheartening setback for Bolivar, forced him to confront the grim reality that this wasn't a unified national struggle, but a complex, brutal civil war. He wrote with great sadness, observing the tragic reality. Quote, "A large part of the Spanish forces are composed of Venezuelans. American blood continues to be shed by Americans. America's children are among the staunchest enemies of independence." It reflected the deep internal divisions and unresolved social grievances plaguing the early movements, a constant struggle against external and internal enemies.
This period sounds like a true roller coaster of exhilarating victories and devastating setbacks. Bolivar's observations about American blood shedding American blood truly highlight the complex internal nature of this conflict. What did he do after Caracas fell again? How did he manage to keep the flame of his grand vision alive despite such immense challenges?
Well, with the fall of Caracas and the collapse of the Second Republic, Bolivar was forced to flee once more. Another period of exile and strategic regrouping. He first went to Cartagena in September 1814, then in May 1815 sought the relative safety and distance of the British island of Jamaica. It was during this profound period of exile, reflection, intense strategic planning, that he wrote one of his most important intellectual contributions, the Letter from Jamaica, an extensive visionary document outlining his grand dream for Latin America, a truly continental vision encompassing the entire landmass from Argentina and Chile up to Mexico.
What was the essence of the letter from Jamaica?
He articulated a powerful sense of shared identity for the diverse peoples of the Americas, a crucial step in forging a united front. He famously stated, and I quote, "We are a great universe of human race. We are a separate world, new in arts and sciences, but old as human society. We are neither Indian nor European, but a part of both." This powerfully captured the unique, mixed heritage of the Creole populations and envisioned a unified future transcending individual colonial identities. For Bolivar, his homeland wasn't just Venezuela, it was all of America. He was absolutely determined to expand the struggle against the Spanish, transforming it from isolated national movements into a concerted continental effort. He understood unity was their greatest weapon against a resurgent Spain.
And from Jamaica, where did he go next?
After Jamaica, Bolivar moved to Haiti. There he received crucial military and financial support from the newly independent Black Republic, led by President Alexandre Pétion. This aid was instrumental in his next phase. In 1817, with renewed vigor and resources, he courageously moved back to Venezuela and captured the strategic city of Angostura, establishing a secure base. Following this significant victory, Bolivar embarked on one of his most daring and legendary campaigns. He marched his army into Colombia, executing an incredible feat by crossing the treacherous high-altitude Andes Mountains in the middle of the rainy season.
Crossing the Andes, that's legendary.
Absolutely. A feat that surprised and demoralized the Spanish. This epic journey brought him to a direct confrontation with the Spanish at the Battle of Boyacá. After decisively defeating the Spanish forces there in August 1819, Bolivar triumphantly entered Bogotá, the capital of New Granada. In December 1819, at a congress convened in Angostura, the Grand Republic of Gran Colombia was formally established, encompassing much of northern South America, and Bolivar, by unanimous acclaim, was made its first president.
Gran Colombia, that was his unified state.
That was the beginning of it. Gran Colombia, designed as a massive federation, initially consisted of three main parts: Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. However, at this point, both Ecuador and much of Venezuela were still under Spanish control. The military struggle had to continue relentlessly. The protracted military struggle for Venezuela's complete liberation continued until the decisive Battle of Carabobo in 1821. A pivotal victory when Venezuela was finally freed from Spanish control, its independence officially declared. The war then shifted south, continuing in Ecuador. Spanish forces were ultimately defeated at the Battle of Pichincha near Quito on May 24, 1822, leading to Ecuador's independence and its incorporation into Gran Colombia.
So the tide had truly turned. What were the final stages?
The final climactic battles against the Spanish took place in 1824, primarily focused on securing Peru's independence, the last major stronghold of royalist power in South America. Following these crucial wars, Spanish colonialism on the continent effectively ended. Much of Latin America was united, at least temporarily, under Bolivar's grand vision. Bolivar personally led Republican forces to defeat the main Spanish army in Peru at the Battle of Junín in 1824, a stunning cavalry engagement at high altitude. And then on December 9, 1824, the last significant royalist army in Peru was definitively eliminated at the Battle of Ayacucho, a pivotal victory that effectively sealed the fate of Spanish colonial rule across the entire continent.
And Bolivia.
As a final act of liberation and tribute, on August 6, 1825, the Upper Peru region gained its independence, and it was named Bolivia after its illustrious liberator, Simon Bolivar. The war period was decisively over. Spain, defeated across the vast continent, retreated to its last remaining Caribbean islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico. These final remnants of its once grand empire were eventually ceded to the United States in 1899 by the Treaty of Paris, marking the complete and final end of the Spanish colonial era in the Americas.
So Bolivar achieved his primary goal of independence for these vast nations, a truly monumental feat. But what about his grand vision for a unified Latin America? It sounds like an incredibly ambitious project that, despite his immense efforts, ultimately faced too many obstacles.
You're absolutely right. It was an incredibly ambitious and ultimately heartbreaking undertaking for him. After the successful wars of independence, Bolivar passionately sought to organize the vast territories of the Gran Colombia Republic, which initially included modern-day Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Panama, under a single political will. He truly dreamed of forming a single unified nation with robust republican regimes and a single liberal constitution governing all these territories. He believed only through this profound unity could Latin America truly thrive, protect itself from external threats, and avoid internal fragmentation, which he constantly feared.
But it didn't hold together.
No, this ambitious project was ultimately undermined by insurmountable challenges. Unresolved disagreements among the newly independent countries, powerful regional interests asserting their autonomy, local power struggles among ambitious leaders, and deeply competing political visions for the new nations. Sadly, the Grand Columbia Project ended in 1830, a mere decade after its founding, dissolving into its constituent parts. Bolívar had secured the continent's independence, a truly monumental achievement that cemented his place in history. But he failed to create the modern, unified republic and the single Latin American nation he envisioned. Even during his lifetime, the process of Spanish America dividing into its current separate states was largely completed, a truly heartbreaking outcome for El Libertador, who had sacrificed so much for unity. Outro.
So what does this all mean for us, looking back at this incredible, sweeping narrative of ambition, conquest, and the fight for freedom? What's the biggest takeaway from this profound chapter of history?
Well, in conclusion, the Spanish establishment of dominion in the New World, leading to the systematic eradication of indigenous civilizations and their cultures, marked not just a period of discovery, but unequivocally an era of brutal occupation and profound conquest. This positioned Spain as a pioneer of a new, aggressive movement in Europe, colonialism, which it then exported on an unprecedented scale. They weren't just exploring, they were claiming, exploiting, and fundamentally reshaping entire societies and landscapes for their own benefit.
It's abundantly clear that 300 years of Spanish colonial rule profoundly impacted the developmental processes of the indigenous populations in ways that reverberate even today. The demographic structure of the continent completely changed, not just through conquest and devastating disease, but with the massive mixing of local populations and Spanish settlers. This intricate, often forced process ultimately led to the formation of a deeply Hispanicized American society. In terms of language, religion, culture, exactly what the Spanish aimed for. It was a transformation of identity, social structures, cultural heritage on a truly massive scale.
And what's truly fascinating, and perhaps a touch ironic, is that the very semi-European Americans created by this system, the Creoles, products of this mixed cultural heritage, educated in Europe, influenced by its liberal ideas, were ultimately the ones who ended the Spanish Empire's presence in America. Simon Bolivar, himself a prime example of this complex heritage, a man of the Enlightenment tempered by the realities of a fractured continent, played a critical, indeed irreplaceable role in initiating the independence movement and finally ending Spain's dominance in Latin America. It was, in essence, the children of the colonial system who learned its ways, absorbed its knowledge, and then ultimately dismantled it.
While the wars of independence certainly forced the Spanish back to the Iberian Peninsula, leaving the newly independent nations to forge their own path, they undeniably left behind societies deeply accustomed to colonial rule. This raises a truly provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Even after winning their independence, how easy do you think it was for these newly independent American nations to truly act as independent individuals or societies? Given how deeply ingrained colonial traditions, structures, and mindsets, from social hierarchies to economic dependencies, had become. This concept of ingrained traditions really makes us wonder about the long-term echoes of such a profound historical shaping. What, if anything, would truly define independence for these nations beyond the physical removal of the colonial power? How do you truly decolonize a mindset, a political system, or an economy that has been built for 3 centuries on colonial foundations? The powerful thought to leave you with, wouldn't you agree? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Spanish colonialism and Simon Bolivar's epic struggle. We hope you feel more well-informed and perhaps a little more curious about the intricate, enduring layers of history. Until next time, keep diving deep.